Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are joining us from. Welcome to this panel session on Beyond the VLE, Technology and Modern Teaching. I was just keeping an eye on the screen there to see the numbers building up, but we've stabilized now. So I think everyone is present and correct, and we are raring to go. Thank you for joining us today. We hope this should be a really good and interactive discussion around the topic of Beyond the VLE. I am joined by a distinguished panel here with us today. I'm going to shortly go around and introduce each of the members of the panel. I should probably start off by introducing myself. I will be your host and chair for the session this afternoon. Myatt, I'm Director of Insight Channels and Educational Enterprise at the University of Birmingham. I've been based at the university for about 6 years now, and responsible, amongst other things, for the growing portfolio of online and distance learning programs that the university offers, originally full degrees, but increasingly we're working on micro-credentials too. I'm now going to go around our panel members and get them to introduce themselves. Just to let you know, we'll come on to housekeeping in a moment on the agenda, but obviously we can't see or hear you, but we do want you to interact. So if you've got any questions at all during the discussion, please do use the Q&A box. But first off, I'm going to introduce the first member of our panel, which is Jonathan Watkins from the University of Birmingham.
Hi everybody, I'm Dr. Jonathan Watkins and I'm a lecturer in digital technologies at the University of Birmingham. A bit about myself, I'll just tell you. My interest is in helping other academics to use technology in their teaching. And I guess as part of that, I'm now leading a new module in designing digital artifacts, which has been taught at university, where I'm hoping that teachers can pick up some of those skills that might be relevant around those ideas. Thanks, Ian.
Excellent, thank you very much, Jonathan. And next up, we have Professor Nico Watkins.
So hello, and I'm really looking forward to being a part of this discussion. I'm Director of Education for all of the engineering and physical sciences programs at the university, and I've long had an interest in what the digital can do for us in facilitating our teaching and particularly making it inclusive for all. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Brilliant. Me too. Next up, we have Louise Krimpotich.
Yes, hello. So I'm the Vice President of Enterprise Services at Digital Ed, and our platform, Mobius, is a courseware platform, is how we term it, and it's specifically designed for STEM courses that really require a lot of computation. So the STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It can be used standalone, but it's often used in conjunction with the VLE to sort of enhance or expand the types of questions that you can ask and the types of grading that you can do for sort of more complex types questions. In my role at Digital Ed, I oversee the content development team as well as our customer success teams, which ultimately are focused on enabling instructors to create and deliver content to their students that help their students in their student learning journey.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Louise. We've had a note on the Q&A from Nico saying, hi, I can't hear anything. I'm hoping that is a local problem, Nico, with your machine. Maybe someone else who has joined us could perhaps just confirm that they are able to listen us know. I know the technicians behind the scenes are looking into that query, Nico. Obviously, Nico, you can't hear my response, but I hope, thank you, Jacosta. Right, we've got a few people saying I can hear. So that gives me the confidence that we're okay. Nico, if you can read my lips, then maybe you need to turn your speakers on or something like that. Thank you very much, Louise. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Ian. My name is Mark Schneider. I teach mathematics and computing at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology, or NAIT. We're located in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And for the last better part of the last 5 years, I've been working directly with faculty from all disciplines, from culinary arts, trades to engineering technologies to a little bit of everything, and helping them build more effective, more robust courseware online. This coming year, I'm looking forward to actually reverting right back to a full lecture. So no longer working directly with faculty, but settling back into the groundwork where I started, and that is actually teaching. So that's where I come from, and look forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. And thank you to everyone who participated, just confirming that they can hear. That's helpful. That's technology at work, isn't it? There you go, interactive technology at work. I think, as you'll have spotted from the introductions, we felt it was important that we had a range of views, not just academic views, of course, and practitioner views, but also from industry as well. So hopefully we'll get the opportunity to talk about the whole kind of suite of considerations. I guess also, I'm sure we will get on to the impact of the pandemic and the changes that may have made in delivery, both in the short term and the long term. Just briefly, in terms of a little bit of housekeeping, obviously, as I said before, all attendees are mute, but please do submit any questions that you may have in the Q&A box, and we will get onto those as soon as possible. Actually, it was a good icebreaker, wasn't it? It was almost a plant getting Nico to kind of say you couldn't hear it, because it proved that people are out there listening, interacting. So thank you very much. Hopefully there'll be plenty more questions. It's worth saying the discussion points on here are just a guide, really. In a moment, I'm going to be going to each of the panelists and find out what do they mean by beyond the VLE, and hopefully that will shed some light on where they're coming from with regards to this discussion. We've also kind of planted a few other kind of discussion themes there, certainly thinking about the difference between managing learning to doing learning, and then talking a little bit about student expectations, student assessment, trust. But quite honestly, the discussion will very much depend on how you want to take it. So if you're online and listening and you want to throw in a question or a thought, then in many ways you are in control of the conversation today. I'm going to stop sharing these slides for now, because I think that way you'll get a better view of each of the panelists. But just going back to the beginning there, I'm going to come to you each individually. I think I'll go in the order that we introduced each other for this one. What do you mean by beyond the VLE? John?
Well, I suppose it's a good place to start. I think I'm responsible for the title of this session, so it kind of, I'll tell you what I had envisaged. I guess beyond the VLE is where I work mostly, and I think it has a number of things. The VLE has been our learning management system, whichever one you want to call it, is a place for managing learning, has a lot of tools in it already, but we always find there are teachers who are pushing the boundaries of that. And so that might be plugging in a third-party system. So for example, Mobius or something like that, which is a specialist piece of software for some of the university. Or it might be that you want to create your own JavaScript web app, so to teach a simulation. So, and then the final thing, I guess, would be, well, what happens when we change VLE or move things outside the VLE? So for me, the topic is all around those ideas. And then the question of how much it gets blended into the VLE or not. So I guess that's how I see beyond the VLE.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to come to Nicola shortly. There was just 2 points of clarification that your response made me think. First of all, and we might discuss and debate this later. When we're talking about VLE, of course, I think it's virtual learning environment is the common phrase used, certainly within the UK and I think much of Europe. I think elsewhere, certainly North America, the term LMS, learning management system, may be used effectively for the same thing. You know, the system of which you know students are interacting with content available for. Although there may be more than just a semantic difference with those two terms. So I just thought for those listening, it's worth just saying that effectively where you're listening from, it may be used. We may use the term LMS. Certainly within the UK, the term VLE tends to be used rather than LMS. The other thing is, sorry, I'm just jumping in slightly, but Louise, given that Jonathan mentioned it, do you want to very briefly explain what Mobius is? Because I'm very mindful that some people may never have come across Mobius before. So in a nutshell, just say what Mobius is so that effectively people understand what John was talking about.
Sure. Mobius, as I mentioned in the introduction, is sort of a courseware platform. So it allows instructors to present lessons, assignments, but also incorporate inline exercises, interactive elements within those lessons, and have it within sort of one environment. The big advantage that we find with Mobius, it has a computation engine behind the scenes. So it really allows for those computational subjects that are doing a lot of calculations, allows instructors to do randomized or algorithmic questions, as well as grade on mathematical equivalency, rather than trying to do sort of a string comparison, for example, or restricting instructors to a small subset of question types like multiple choice. So.
So a tool that could plug into a VLE or LMS, but effectively is incredibly powerful from the sound of it in terms of, I guess, STEM-based subjects in particular would benefit from that computational side of things. Thank you very much, Louise. I just thought it was important to get that clarification. Nicola, beyond the VLE, what does that mean from your perspective?
Okay, so first of all, possibly what the VLE delivers for me from the perspective of an educator is that I can sort of see the modules that my teams are responsible for in a curated way, and I know what the teacher can see, what the postgraduate support can see, and what the students can see at any given time. And often you'll have people debating which VLE they prefer depending on how that curation has taken place. I think for me, moving beyond the VLE, it's the interactivity that comes in and the being able to personalize, effectively have your own indexing of the material and to be able to pick up and work with exercises, be they mathematical or otherwise, which then enable you in a personalized manner to learn about perhaps things that you did 2 years previously that you suddenly find you need now. So that would be the sort of the organizational option, and then there may be VR or other bits that seamlessly link through.
That gives us plenty to go on, doesn't it? Thank you very much, Nicola. I'll come to you next, Louise. You know, your views on beyond the VLE.
Yeah, I think as Nicola said, the VLE, it's a tool that is used by instructors to sort of organize their courses and organize their students within their courses. But because it is a very broad tool, we often find that there are certain aspects or certain types of functionality that it doesn't contain. So in my mind, beyond the VLE, you're looking at how do you enhance the VLE experience? How do you enhance the students' learning to really incorporate things that students are expecting in today's world?
Yes, and actually, I have noticed there is a question come in from Hassan, which we will come on to because I think it's really interesting about thinking about how technology can be used in developing countries as well. So Hassan, will come to that question shortly. I just want to finish with this kind of like opening remarks, and then we'll make sure that the discussion goes on that journey. Mark, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Ian. For myself, and I think for the NATE community, beyond the VLE discussion really stems from really pushing the limitations of existing LMSs and finding other tools that kind of incorporate into the learning environment to provide a much more resound experience for students and an experience that students can truly value and walk away from. Much the same that maybe a physical campus can do for students in terms of recreation, in terms of community. I think a lot of times beyond the VLE, when I think about that, I think about how can our digital environment sort of enhance student well-being in the same way and be responsive to what students are expecting, provide students with robust feedback, and really provide students with that wholesome experience that when they leave our campus and they've graduated, that they can look back and really start to think, man, that institution was really on top of the world in terms of what they did digitally. And I think for us, we can't expect everything to be packaged into one small, simple LMS. It needs to have other tools brought in for student communication, for student assessment, for really authenticity throughout the whole experience.
So that's great, and it's kind of like taking us beyond the VLE. I'm just kind of taking a step backwards and thinking, whoa, there are certain people that, you know, have just been thrown into digital learning who perhaps never touched a VLE before and had never come across the idea of an LMS and VLE. And so to some extent, kind of, you know, we're just realizing that, you know, I need to get on the VLE, and we're already talking about beyond the VLE. And I guess in a way that links into Hassan's point about the use of technology in poor communities where there isn't that technological infrastructure. I guess combining those things together, how do we make sure we're bringing people with us so that we're not kind of scaring them off with technology? I mean, Louise, that must be something that you come across all the time, right? How do you make sure you kind of draw that fine line between kind of like cutting edge, being as good as you can from a technology point of view versus people just being somewhat scared and nervous about it?
No, that's a great question, and it's definitely one that, you know, that educators all over really kind of struggle with, because you want to provide these wonderful learning opportunities for students, but at the same time you have to think about, will all of my students be able to access this? Will they be able to, you know, take advantage of this material? And one of the things that we often see is educators offering, you know, learning experiences in different ways. So, you know, similar to sort of accessibility concerns, if you offer content in a couple of different ways, then students are able to, you know, sort of meet the system where they are and still take the learning from it.
And Jonathan, what about you?
Well, I remember being at a conference where I saw a very interesting sort of talk on this topic, and it was around access to education in Africa, and they were saying the challenges there are quite interesting. So one of the things I think was working very well, and it can actually translate all over really, is the use of mobile phones in teaching and education. So they were through government schemes providing mobile phones to students in Africa. And that's good. It's a good start, and it gives them access to a platform. But then one of the things they're finding was reliability of access was an issue. So I think that one of the things that these platforms must be considering is the use of offline capabilities within these things. So to get very slightly technical, the web can support offline stuff. So you can have a website that can work without an internet connection. This is completely possible now in which you first accessed it. And then there's some new APIs called the Experience API, which is coming online, which is all about offline learning. So learning happens in the VLE, but it can also happen outside the VLE, and recording those things. So I think that's the path we need to go. So it's about accessibility, but we all think that's important. But and so we've all had this challenge through COVID this year as well, of technology and access there too. And so mobile phone has been the savior for a lot of students. And so I think that's a common problem. But so I think encouraging and asking technology providers to provide offline mobile friendly apps is one of the ways to start doing this.
And Mark, you've got some direct experience around working with developing countries, is that right?
Well, yes, Ian, thank you. Our institution has had some experience working with developing countries. So most recently, we were working with sort of a startup civil engineering educational product in Nairobi, which was very interesting. So technology was very limited. We were able, though, to sort of leverage a lot of the assets that we were acquiring as an institution and sort of hand that off to students in that part of the world. We've also had some experience working in Cuba. Not recent, I guess it hasn't been for about 4 or 5 years now, but prior to the last 4 or 5 years, we had a long-standing contract working in Cuba. Mostly at that time, of course, it was all Flash-based. We were doing a lot of Flash-based assets and working with them on developing some really engaging products for their educational markets there. But again, I guess that kind of speaks toward beyond the VLE is the need to sort of stay on the pedestal as Flash went away. What can we do to replace that and work with these institutions to continue to make sure that their assets stay strong and their students continue to learn effectively?
Actually, I think that's a really good point about the choice of technology and platform, really, Mark, isn't it? And how educators, institutions can try and make sure that the content doesn't become redundant as a result of their technological choice. I know Flash very well, and actually, I was leading the. There's a popular website in the UK called BBC Bitesize that I ran for a while that actually the content was almost all Flash for a while, and I inherited at the point of which all the content was Flash, at the point of which they decided that Flash was going to be effectively not supported in most browsers anymore, and I had to lead the conversion of that content into something that was far more neutral. So we went down the HTML5 route. But I guess, Louise, how do you, as a technological supplier, help customers I guess ensure that their investment is not going down a dead end?
Yeah, another great question, and one that, with the Flash to HTML5 is a perfect example where people were embedding interactive elements that were flash based, and then you need to be able to support the upcoming technology. So part of that is really, you know, as a technology company, you have to be aware of what technology is happening and what are the trends that are happening in technology, so that you can, you know, either help people move to the newer technologies, or in some cases you're able to create almost a seamless conversion for them. We've done that in the past, where you have an older, you know, question type or developed in something different, and are able to sort of behind the scenes update it into an HTML version that will then continue to run. But it's definitely something that you have to stay on top of, the technology trends and what's happening and where are things going. And like Jonathan said, he, you know, talking about mobile phones, that was something that, you know, 20 years ago wasn't really a consideration. People would create the web page for a specific size, and now being able to automatically fit to whatever screen size the students have is super important.
Excellent. Thank you, Louise. And I just building on that, I guess we talked about making technology accessible and usable from a student perspective, and that was touching a little bit on the institution. I guess thinking about the educators, and I guess in many places, certainly up until recently, the assumption has been many educators have, you're given a tool and you're expected to just do it. That doesn't feel sustainable, and I think increasingly institutions that take this seriously are starting to employ instructional designers at a much greater scale, effectively people who understand how to get the best out of technology. They understand learning pedagogic approaches and help educators get the best out of it. But you know, I'm going to come to you, Nicola. How do, I guess, universities and similar institutions kind of start to head towards the recognition that it's no longer a, you know, it can't necessarily be you know, all down to the educator to provide these experiences?
Well, I think the first thing is to not get too carried away with the shiny toys, and to remember what it is you're endeavoring to teach, and actually where the tricky bits are for the students. And then those are the bits that, once you sort of identified where those learning challenges are, that's the bits that you can then talk with sort of the learning technologists. We have John in our team, as to how you might go about designing assets, toy models, simulations that will help students over that particular learning hurdle. So there has to be a mix of the standard, the being able to read perhaps sort of, you know, quick fire questions to work through. They don't want sort of a massively complicated, exciting thing every 5 minutes, because apart from anything else, that becomes very draining, and doesn't tend to actually lean to students remembering their learning. They just remember which particular shiny thing they were in at that point. So isolate the 1 or 2 things per learning session that you think you would like really to drill down on, work out why it's difficult, and then go to the learning designer. And I think for us, what's worked well is having people that have got STEM backgrounds, and therefore it might not be in their particular direct area of expertise, but they'll understand what will play well and what will be possible within the technology.
So, Jonathan, as I guess someone who is both learning technologist and academic, you kind of straddle that divide. But so you must see it from both sides. But you know, are institutions investing enough resource and I guess money ultimately in this area yet?
Well, that's an interesting question. I have to say yes, don't I?
No, I think we could have more.
Yeah, that's true. I think I'm going to answer that in a sort of roundabout way, because there's a few points that came up on there which I want to touch on, which I think are really interesting. So I think the HTML5 Flash thing that we all know about because we've sort of lived through it, it's not the first time that's happened. You know, it's been happening since, I mean, the first computer that I would consider a VLE sort of platform was in 1960, a platform called Plato, which was a load of dumb terminals connected to a mainframe machine. And then they had question types and things like that on there. And then they just kept going. And so new technology comes out, teachers have to learn new technology. And what I think happens is It's a bit touching on what Nicola says. Lecturers come into a course, a new lecturer comes into a course. I want to teach this course. I want to get to grips with where the students are stuck. So I speak to the lecturer who taught it last time, ask where they got stuck. And I look at what's around me, what's modern, what the students might be expecting, what I can play with. And so they rewrite it again. So that's what happens. And it happens all the time. And I don't think it's a bad thing. I think the danger, I think one of the dangers is going off on too many tangents can be quite dangerous. And I think some people should pioneer there, but I think stability is quite important. So this is already a solved problem, and it's called standards. There are a lot of standards around education. And when I think people go off and have their own idea, they should come back together, get together standards agencies to work out how we can take the best bits of those and then move forward with that to enable this new technology. So it's obviously about the teaching, and it should support that. But I don't think we should be scared of rewriting things. We are learning how to do new things. I think that's quite exciting. And as far as universities and how much they're spending and things like that, I think there's a load of different models that happen. So sometimes lecturers have to learn how to do it themselves. Some universities invest in massive teams of learning designers to help lecturers to build content. So Waterloo's a great example of this. They've got sort of envious of the size of team they have, building resources and things like that. And that's a really, really good dynamic to create there of supporting teachers to do their teaching. That's not to stop the teachers that are interested in doing it themselves, but it's a really great dynamic. It's very efficient. And I think that's kind of how we should be going. So yeah, I think that as these technologies become more complicated, we've got more people with skills around us to support it, I think.
For a moment there, John, I thought you were going to take us back to the whole VHS versus Betamax kind of discussion, which of course is another example of kind of like not always the best technology wins, and that I guess that's another line of conversation as well. But going back to the kind of point of the panel, Mark, interested in your views, but also Rutmana's kind of put a question on the Q&A, which I'm hoping you can also have a go building on your previous example about developing countries. How would a VLE work in a remote area? Could it work for places like Indonesia?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I'm glad you brought that back to me because I didn't want to type all of this, but in some instances with very remote communities, what we've done is we've actually set up some closed networks, and we were able to establish some closed networks with multiple terminals. So they weren't really, they weren't at all internet accessible, but they were able to access, a server or mainframe and communicate with one another through terminals. So we were able to sort of create a small network where at least people could digitally communicate with one another in these very remote communities, but not necessarily digitally communicate with the world. So there was a lot of having to extract some of our core LMS assets and some of our core assets from our other tools and find ways to sort of locally host those on servers there. We also, in some cases, were able to leverage mobile phones. There was a lot of communities where internet was still accessible via mobile phone. And in some areas, it's to my understanding as well that we were able to utilize some bandwidth through power line internet connections or through really just simple power sources. And there's been, I think, some advances in that industry as well recently. But that's one of the things. It's one of our big challenges is as an institute, if we do go into these remote communities, what infrastructure do they have? What can they support? And really, something that we often don't think about, even in our own communities, is can our end users support the bandwidth that's needed to access this specific tool? So if we're recording video and it's only available in sort of a 1080p or high definition, are our students going to be able to do that? Are they also going to be able to follow along in a lecture where you're webcasting 50 students at a time? So I think it's not only something we have to be mindful in remote communities, but something we should be mindful even locally here in Canada, as we have students in rural areas that have difficulty accessing larger bandwidth. So
I think that's a great shout, actually, Mark. Let's not see it just as a developing country problem. The idea of consuming content where there isn't necessarily the bandwidth is something that I think is universal. Certainly, there are communities in the UK that do struggle with decent bandwidth, and actually, there's also something about flexibility. About enabling people to study wherever they are, perhaps in transit where you can't get consistent kind of bandwidth, whether that's train or plane, etc. So I think thinking about how content can be viewed remotely, I guess, without necessarily always having a fat pipe behind it is really important. A great question. Questions coming in. Elizabeth, we'll get to yours in a minute. I have seen it, but Joanne, I think I'm going to throw Louise your question, which to those who aren't necessarily following Quest, there's a question around, you know, there's confronting, there's different conceptions of what learning designers do, right? Competing perceptions of what learning designers do, and often creating content isn't necessarily one of them, and instead it's about how to use the said content. So interesting to hear your views on that, Louise.
Yeah, and the reason that I'm interested in this one, John mentioned the University of Waterloo and their team, and they actually have two separate teams. So they have one team that is focused on creating the content, and so they work with instructors on what is it that the instructor would like to see, and they work with them on designing and helping them create the course and creating some aspects of it. But then they also have a group that is really focused on how do you teach using these tools. And so they actually had, you know, in their situation, they're able to have both aspects. But it's definitely an interesting concept because, you know, like a lot of titles, people wear many different hats. And, you know, part of the discussion around being able to teach learning designers is understanding what is it that people are going to expect from them.
Looking at Q&A, I think you answered Joanne's question. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that badly, by the way, but he said bingo. So I'm assuming that's good news. Either that or he's got some kind of list of acronyms and terminology that we're using that is ticking off as we're going. I'm not sure which of those it is, but let's see as we've answered the question well. I'll take that. Actually, there's a natural extension, I think, on that to a question that Elizabeth asked a while ago. And I guess this is something that will, I'm keen to hear everyone's views on, but you know, the role of learner analytics. So Elizabeth said, I'd like to hear from people about the role of learner analytics and you know, the functionality that can enable you to support the learner experience. Nicola, do you want to start off on this one?
I thought that one might be coming to me.
Sorry.
So I think learner analytics is something that has to be handled very carefully from an ethical perspective in the first instance. In so much as we should see it as information that belongs to the learner, and that they should be aware of how an institution is collating the things that they have or haven't interacted with, depending on which sign we're looking at, and you know, how they're putting their marks together. And I think from my perspective, that should be a very open discussion. And from there, one then needs to actually have an education program which tells them, this is what your data looks like. And this indicates in these areas, you know, you're steaming ahead, you're actually perhaps ahead of the cohort in terms of the materials that you've accessed. It looks like you may have holes in your prior understanding in this particular area. So it's very much for the learner, a digest of the journey that they are on. Of course, on the flip side of that, from the instructor, you're looking to pick up those students that perhaps whose engagement has tailed off. And you want to be able to reach out to them because they may be the least interested in seeing their learner analytics. But I think it has to be at the outset a partnership of the sharing of that material. Otherwise, I think there is a real risk of it feeling sort of a big brother, and I really don't want to be a part of that system. And we've seen plenty of that happening sort of within the social media space. And we've seen the different types of policies that have happened. I think we need to learn from those and sort of as a community, develop what we think to be the appropriate ground rules for, and that may depend on sort of the country that you're in. It may depend on how young your learners are, as to whether they can give consent for their data being used in that way. So I actually think the challenges here are the sort of the ethical social ones, rather than what is the sort of from a tech perspective, the sort of the fun, exciting bit as to what can we pull together and what can we learn from that.
And I guess there's two sides to it as well, isn't there? There's the helping learners learn about themselves and understand the motivational kind of like, you know, almost the Fitbit of learning, kind of like, you know, helping them learn better. Then there's also helping the institution understand how to help learners learn better as well. So I guess there's the macro and the micro, the individual kind of helping themselves, but also as an institution, learning how actually you can adapt to the different ways of learning what's worked, what hasn't, from looking at the analytics that you get out of these systems. Mark, I'm interested in your experience.
Can I just add that I think the bit we forget for the students that feel themselves to be failing, and our data shows them to be not doing great as well, it's how those conversations happen, and that can be really hard when it's sort of black and white on the screen and there's nowhere left for them to hide, as it were. What support do we put in place then?
And I guess the hope of making that data available to them is that it's not a complete surprise to them. Therefore, they're not necessarily finding out first time at that conversation, but there may be some denial. Mark, interested in your experience around learner analytics.
Thank you. In learner analytics is probably maybe the topic that I'm probably most passionate about. And I think one of the biggest problems that we have with faculty interpreting learning analytics is the failure to connect what is digital to what they would be doing if it was in an actual physical space. If we were lecturing in an actual physical space and we've got 100 faces in front of us and you know 60 of those are very sleepy at a point in our lecture, we're going to be looking to engage them differently, and we're going to be looking to provide them with a different experience. And I think learner analytics offer us that same opportunity. If we've got 100 different students watching a certain video, and at the 3-minute mark, we're noticing they're closing their browsers and they're dropping off, it's possible that you know that video got exceptionally boring at the 2-minute mark and they disconnected. And I think that's a huge part of what we need to be thinking about and be responsible for digitally is what would we be doing in an actual physical classroom. I was hired to teach in a physical classroom, you know, over 10 years ago. And at that time, we were early adopters in, I would say, in sort of the online, in a really large online educational market that I sort of spearheaded more than anything in terms of getting into online courses early. But I was hired to teach in a physical classroom, and I think I need to make sure that I bring in that same level of responsiveness with what I produce digitally. And I think analytics is the way to do that. I think how we can tie analytics to AI and use it to sort of guide differentiated instruction, to provide students with different experiences, to make sure students are able to universally access our courseware. AI really is sort of that pinnacle that can sort of put it all together for us. At least that's the way I look at it.
And I suspect the topic of learner analytics could very easily fill not only the rest of this webinar, but plenty others beside. And I can tell that a number of people on here are passionate about. I'm just kind of bringing in another point that Elizabeth made, and I think it could be controversial, but you know, I guess to what extent we are moving towards, we should move towards learning as a service. So that it can be dispensed at the point of need, like you get with kind of like an IT industry, versus, I guess, learning as something effectively is a long, you know, the more traditional campus-based thing. You giving yourself more time. I guess it's that kind of snack-sized, bite-sized learning versus the more academic experience. But John, do you want to have a go at kind of talking about this? You know, should we be moving towards learning as a service? Is that a good thing? I'm opening a can of worms here, aren't I?
Yeah, it's a very dangerous question to ask me, this one, I think, but I have strong views, I guess, so we'll see how it goes. So I think that in my experience, what I've seen deep universities type learning, let's say, call it that one, be much more personal about the institution, how the particular lecturers want to teach. I have seen a lot of service teaching around standards, so tick box exercises, making sure that people have cut off standards, or training around things like how to learn Microsoft Excel, something like that, you know, six skills for highly motivated people, that sort of thing. But I think but learning is messy. You have to wrestle with it. And I don't think it's about I personally don't think it's about micro learning. I I think it's about wrestling with concepts and having time to sink in. And when I've in the past tried to create bite-sized things, I have found that it doesn't connect well enough. And so I think personally, I think a well thought out lecture course is what you create in the start. I find it harder to fit bite-sized things into that than I'm creating myself. That's my opinion. Now, I'm sure people don't agree with me there, but that's how I view it, actually.
And I'm gonna, I was gonna say, Nicola, do you want to add anything more to that? I'm mindful we've got lots of questions coming in, but I'm mindful you might have some thoughts on that one too.
So I think there is a place for service teaching. Imagine that you have learnt the fundamental theory for a particular area. I mean, my background is physics, but you may then need to understand how to operate a particular experiment for the lab. I would say at that point, that is a piece of service learning at the point of need. And actually, you know, there's not much point learning about the different buttons and sort of how you might select the frequency ranges 2 weeks in advance, because that's not the sort of information that you are likely or usefully going to remember. So there's the long term, there's the wrestling with the tricky problems, and then there's the short, how do I do this now? And I think one needs both.
So that's what I was going to say. Mixed economy, room for both. Feels like the right positioning at the moment, doesn't it? I'm going to throw to Louise now on a final question from Elizabeth that kind of goes back to the conversation we're having earlier about accessibility and bandwidth. But you know, the fact that, you know, if people are accessing learning on different types of devices, then size kind of matters on the screen. So it's difficult to write a thesis on a phone, for example. And she's saying, should we adapt course based on the devices that students have at their disposal, I guess, versus expecting students to be flex and have the sense to flex of the devices that they have. Louise, you must have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, and it is another great question in terms of, are we teaching the concept just how we want to teach it, or are we really meeting the student where they are and you know, helping them on their learning journey? So I think, you know, there are going to be certain times when you're going to design a course because you're going to be teaching in the classroom, and this is how you deliver this course. But I do think there are times, whether, you know, if you're teaching in remote areas, or if you have a group of students that are in a remote area that their bandwidth isn't going to be good, that what you need to do is you need to design your course appropriately, and maybe not use, as Nicola said, all the bells and whistles, because you know that they're going to have a hard time finding it or accessing it, being able to use it appropriately. So I definitely think there is, you know, room for both. And I think as we see, you know, over the last couple of years and going forward, we're going to see more cases where we want to use the technology. Where's the right place to use the technology, and what's the right place to, you know, implement certain features?
Thank you. Mark, do you want to add to that?
Sure thing. Well, that's actually one, Louise has brought up a really good point. And that's one thing that I think I've really valued from the platform that Digital Ed has brought to us through Mobius at our institution, is the whole concept of universal design for learning. And that is the ability to package into your assessments, and really the student learning, the ability for students to respond in the ways that they feel most natural to respond to that given question. And I think, I mean, when we go back and look at online learning 20 years ago, if the student circled C on the multiple choice answer and he got it wrong, they got 0 out of 1. They didn't get a chance to really explain themselves or where they were coming from. And we weren't really able to really even provide any kind of effective feedback as to what was correct and what wasn't correct. I think it's something Digital Ed has done really well with their platform, is given instructors the opportunity to allow students to respond to questions in very natural ways that suit the STEM discipline, and move beyond multiple choice, and perhaps even combine multiple choice with, say, a written response feedback, or something that can be, you know, more direct on the device that they're working with, and really respond in a way that's most natural to them. And I think that is something that we have to be absolutely mindful when we're presenting something to students on screen.
Thank you, Mark. I think that's really important. I suspect some of that will come up we've got about 15 minutes of discussion left, and I'm mindful we've got some good questions coming in. I just want to go to one that Christian's asked, because I think it might be on everyone's mind at the moment. So the pandemic has forced a lot of universities, schools to shift to online learning, not necessarily in a planned way, not necessarily in the way in which perhaps, if you rewind the clocks and we're talking about moving to kind of online learning and long-term strategies, you weren't necessarily expecting to have the catalyst that the pandemic provided. So are universities going to go back to being purely campus-based? Do we think that effectively online learning will continue to grow in its importance, even if universities go back to primarily being campus-based? Mark, you look like you were about to come in, so I don't want to go for it.
Sure thing, Ian. I think absolutely it's going to continue to grow. It's going to continue to grow because quite frankly, one thing that the pandemic has taught our institution is that we're able to better reach markets that in some cases, we didn't know existed before. And the more an institution, especially an institution of our size, if we can continue to grow at linear or exponential rates, we're going to continue to try to do so. And we're reaching markets that in areas that we didn't know were possible before. We certainly were reaching remote markets before, but in very selected, very few disciplines. And now through the pandemic, we're seeing disciplines that we didn't expect to be effective online and disciplines that we didn't expect to be able to reach students in their native countries and be able to partake in academic discussions in those countries. And I don't think we're going to give up any groundwork on that at all. I think it's going to continue to surge ahead.
Nicola, from your perspective, how does that compare?
I think it's close in the sense that we definitely found that we can deliver a significant fraction of teaching over a time period online. But for me, it's very much sitting alongside, at least for our core undergraduate programs, the sort of the core on-campus learning how to learn experience. So I think that where online has opened up is potentially it's brought the CPD market to life in a way, and I think accelerated that probably by 5 years compared to what it was doing.
Thank you, Nicola. There's some good questions coming in from John and Ratmana that are linked, which I'm going to come to shortly. I just wanted to take the opportunity, and John, you mentioned it at the start. You know, this webinar is kind of linked to a module that you're kind of developing at the moment at the University of Birmingham. In a moment, our producer, magically behind the scenes, Sarah, is going to kind of do a quick poll for all participants to kind of contribute to. But while that's happening, John, do you want to just talk briefly about the module and your motivations behind creating it?
Yeah, and it links to, thanks for that. Yeah, it's nice. And I think it's interesting because it links to a lot of the things that have been discussed, which is what is a learning designer and what roles do they take? And as we've discussed, there's a lot of topics here, and learning designers need to be aware and sometimes very skilled in a number of these topics. So my module is, we're teaching a truly cross-discipline course here. So we have my module, which is essentially web design for learning designers. It's the core bits of web design that you need to build digital artifacts. But we have other modules on the course around learning analytics, so data science techniques and sort of stats for that you might want to use to design and analyze data. Then we have pedagogy in there as well. So there's a lot of really deep dives on a lot of these disciplines that we're building through this whole course of this program. So one of the things I took a choice when I built this course is I wasn't going to teach you something that you could read in the manual of a book of an online help system. I wanted to teach you something deep and actually so you can actually learn new skills to wrestle with it. So my course will take you through from a complete beginner to having the core web skills needed to build digital artifacts online. So that's the goal. So I think it's an exciting thing to do, and I think it might be that you want to then take that and go on to do more in that space, or you might have now a good understanding of security and technology and what's possible. So when someone asks you, how do we handle an offline situation where I've got a student with a mobile phone, but it only works in bad internet, you'll be able to answer that question because you'll know how that works. And I think that's a really interesting skill, and that's where that's the idea of this course, to really give those really appropriate skills that are so needed nowadays.
So I do hope that resonates. It certainly resonates with me. Hopefully it resonates to people in the audience as well. As if by magic, Sarah has just put up a poll. Please do just take a few seconds to fill that in for us if you can. And we will crack on. We've got about 9 minutes left. As I said, John and Romana have got some great questions that I think is bringing us to kind of like a natural conclusion. But before I go into them, Andrew has asked, how do you see blended learning working, I guess, in combination with online? Will it work? And I say this knowing full well that Nicola mentioned that earlier today she was testing out some cameras that were going to try and help the conundrum of how you actually bring, you know, people who are face-to-face in a lecture theatre together with people who might be joining remotely. Easier said than done, I think, Nicola, but good to hear. Can you give us some initial views on how you're trying to approach that?
So I think the blended learning with these sort of two cohorts of students potentially quite large. I think my concern as someone that could be the person that stood at the front effectively trying to run two orchestras, as it feels, is that you could end up with a much shallower learning experience just because the person that's teaching you has got so many buttons and video screens to be controlling. So that we really need to think about why it is we need to do it blended, and how, once you've made that decision, how it is you're going to ensure that it is worthwhile, that extra sort of layer of complexity in terms of the interaction between the students that are in the room and are remote. And I think it's those bits that are definitely in early days. And we've seen some better and worse solutions. The most expensive is not necessarily the best, is one of the things that comes through in this. You're actually looking for simplicity of use. So it can happen, but be careful of the load of the poor educator that's also trying to ensure that the students have got material transmitted and sort of discussed in a sensible manner.
I love that, the reflection of being the conductor at the front, trying to conduct two orchestras. That gives a feel for the complexity of the challenge that academics and educators may be facing in the future. Mark, I'm going to come to you, I guess, on that, but I also want to bring in Romana's question, which is, you know, what's the difference between like the traditional VLEs like Canvas or Moodle or Blackboard, and you know, Romana mentions the one used in Singapore called SLS. How does that compare to things like Google Classroom that are coming online now?
Well, I wanted to quickly comment too on Nicola's point there with regards to you know, online students are blended and students in classroom working together. And one of the things that I first thought of was, we talk about gamification in the classroom, and really one thing that I'll say, perhaps with not everyone will agree with, but video games in itself, I think, offer an opportunity for people to learn. And when we looked at video games, people used to play video games by just sitting in front of it by themselves and learning something. Whether that was relevant or not is debatable, but they were learning something by themselves. And now video games are very connected. They're multiplayer. And when we look at something like Twitch, you've got people playing online and then others in person, and they're communicating with one another. And I think that's something that we have to be mindful of, is that that's what's happening, is we do have physical learners interacting with virtual learners together in the video game space. And I think it's going to transcend into the educational space. Just last semester, I had students set up their own Discord channel so they could communicate with one another about topics on the final exam. Little to my knowledge was this Discord channel even set up. And I think that says a lot as to what our learning designers and our faculty have to learn about tools. Is they have to be at the forefront all the time thinking, what can our students do? How do our students want to communicate? And be mindful of that and adapt to it, rather than just shut it down. Let's find out how we can use that tool to be more effective in the classroom.
And actually, Mark, you've done a really good job there of teeing up John McDermott's question, which is how do we see the role of learning designers change over the coming decades? Thinking specifically about the impact of AI and formalizing the role within education, but I think also everything else that you've just said. Louise, do you want to go on that one first, and then John, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I was going to say, in terms of is online learning growing, or will it grow now that we start to go back? I think there definitely is that place for that hybrid learning environment, and being able to meet students where they are, whether they learn better in person, whether they really they like to digest material and then ask questions, and the hybrid environment really gives the opportunity to do that. And I completely agree with the sentiments that have been brought here in terms of it's really, it's not going to be simple. It's something that we have to continually work towards, to think of what is next, what's coming up, how can we use it, how can we best, improve our students' learning experience. And I think one of the things that we've learned during the pandemic is that, some of the material that we put online, when we go back in person, we've realized that online material helps all of our students, not necessarily just the students that are remote. And that's an important thing to keep in mind as well as we move forward.
John. I've not had to do this yet, but John, you're on mute.
Yes, I did it. Excellent. Yes, so I think as the fields get broader, we need experts in those fields. And I think that's what happens. And we're talking about a lot of technologies here, we've got pedagogy, we've got technology, we've got data science going on. And so you do have to then create experts in those areas. So a learning designer may be somebody who has traditionally was somebody who may thought about maybe more, as we said earlier, it's got lots of different flavors, but it might be that you're a specialist in one area and you have a good knowledge of the other areas and how they interact. And I think that's how it's going to be changing. Yeah, that's how I see it anyway.
Absolutely. Mark, anything more to add on this one?
No, I think we pretty well covered it. We always talk about remaining engaged and learning forever and continual learning, and I think that's something that's going to exist here without question. Is we expect our students to continue to grow and continue to learn as they enter industry, and as faculty, we're continuing to grow and continue to learn and learning new tools and learning new ways to present those tools. I think that's something that we have to expect of learning designers and faculty alike.
Yeah, it feels like it's not going to get any easier, does it? Nicola?
I would agree that it's a field that has got to grow because it's becoming integral. It's becoming the plumbing of our sort of education delivery, and no one would assume that a single person would be expert on the entire plumbing system.
Thank you. John, did you have something else to add?
Yeah, maybe a little story I'm going to maybe finish up with. So this has been happening all the way through. It's a kind of thread I want to hammer home. But when the computers were first introduced into the classrooms, they were introduced because students were going to have to use computers in their jobs. That was one of the first impetuses of it. And what happened then was the teachers didn't know how to use the computers, and the students became the experts. And as Mark talked about earlier, students can communicate better than we can facilitate. And so this is a challenge that we're always going to have. They're always going to be slightly ahead of us in various ways. And we're going to always be playing catch up. But that's the game. And then so we have to keep learning, just like the students do.
Thank you, John. And I'm very mindful that we're off on the hour, but thank you for all the questions that have come in. There was what Rikita made a comment and kind of said, can natural interactions move online in a classroom format? I hope we've gone part way there with this session today in terms of, I hope you've enjoyed the interactions that we've had. It's certainly been really valuable, the amount of conversation and contributions that we've had from everyone who has been asking questions and sharing some of their own insight as as well. I can see that is still going on. Elizabeth, you asked a great question around GDPR and all of that. I'm afraid I've got to bring it to a close, so we won't go into that now, but it does feel like the conversation was just getting going. So thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. If you are keen to carry on the conversation, then do please, there is an opportunity to follow on the conversation. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to Mark, Nicola, John and Louise. I hope you've enjoyed this session as much as I have. And you never know, look out for a future session along a similar subject soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.